even better. Paul Harvey, on his September 25, 1997 noon broadcast, said this: "Women have been honored on American postage stamps for more than 100 years, starting with one woman who is not an American, Queen Isabella, in 1893. Since then, 86 women have been honored, ranging from Martha Washington to Marilyn Monroe. Also, many women authors like Louisa May Alcott and Emily Dickinson, Willie Cather, Rochelle Carson. But I can name an American woman author who has never been honored thus, though her writings have been translated into 148 languages. More than Marx or Tolstoy, more than Agatha Christie, more than William Shakespeare. Only now is the world coming to appreciate her recommended prescription for optimum spiritual and physical health. Ellen White. You don't know her? Get to know her. Paul Harvey." Great advertisement. You may or may not know. Pardon me? And the rest of the story. Well, actually, the rest of the story is Paul Harvey was married to a Seventh-day Adventist and had a lot of respect for Adventists. That's why he often made positive comments about Seventh-day Adventists. And he was good friends with George Vanderman, founder of It Is Written. Even wrote recommendations to some of George Vanderman's books. So, interesting connection with these folks. I've also heard that Billy Graham said he read Ellen White's books and used them in his sermons. But that, I must say, especially since this is on the internet, that I don't have that documented. I've heard that from various sources, but I've never seen that documented, so I'm just mentioning that as a possibility. We talked about Ellen White's marriage to James White this morning. I want to say a few words about her children. This is Ellen's firstborn, Ellen and James' firstborn, Henry. Henry died prematurely at 16 years of age, pneumonia. He was outside helping fold brochures one afternoon and caught a chill, and it eventually resulted in pneumonia. In those days, if you got pneumonia, that pretty much meant you were on your way to the grave. There were no antibiotics, and that was pretty much it. And that was his experience. It was a rather slow death, and he was able to make peace with family and friends. He felt that his example to the young people in the Battle Creek area was not that good. And so he had some last words. And there was a book written in his honor called Appeals to Youth. And on the Ellen G. White CD-ROM, you can access that book there. And it's got a lot of interesting things, letters that Ellen White wrote to her children and some of Henry's last words. I can't imagine what it would be like to lose a 16-year-old son. That's got to be extremely difficult. So the Whites truly experienced a lot of grief. She said after Henry died, he was, unlike his mother, he was a gifted singer. And she said after he died, "When our sweet singer was borne to the grave, and we no more heard his early song, ours was a lonely home." And in his closing words, shortly before he died, he made an appeal to his friends. Henry said, "Don't take my life for an example. I would appeal to all my young friends to not let the pleasures or accomplishments of the world eclipse the loveliness of the Savior. Remember that the deathbed is a poor place to prepare for an inheritance in the second life. Spend the best of your days in serving the Lord. Farewell." And as he came to the point of his death, some of his last words were, "Heaven is sweet." So Ellen and James have the confidence in knowing, or at least the rest of their lives, they have the confidence knowing they would see their oldest son in heaven because he died knowing Jesus. Our pioneers went through a lot of sacrifices. They also, out of the 4 sons, they had 4 sons, 2 died. After Henry, there was the death of the little infant child, John Herbert. This is an interesting story. John Herbert was born in the fall of 1860. That was a time, you might remember, we celebrated the 150th anniversary of choosing the name Seventh-day Adventist. Well, it was during those meetings in September that they chose the name Seventh-day Adventist. And little baby had been born shortly before that, and James and Ellen were so focused on finding a name for the church that they didn't take time to name their son. And so he went through that period without a name, and then as soon as the meetings ended, James had to travel to a crisis at another church. And so Ellen was left with the baby, and they still hadn't chosen a name. And so we have some of the correspondence, and she would write James, well, the little nameless one was happy this morning. Another letter, she would say, the nameless one is in good health. And another letter, the nameless one is not doing too well today. So for a number of weeks, they used the term nameless one. And she wrote to her best friend and said, I was just wrapping up little nameless one in a warm blanket. Please send us a name. And so they finally chose the name John Herbert. Unfortunately, though, little John Herbert became ill. And his mother watched him suffer. He died of a very unfortunate illness called erysipelas, which was a skin disease and very painful, and he died a slow death. Ellen wrote about that experience. She said, my dear babe was a great sufferer. 24 days and nights we anxiously watched over him. At times I could not control my feelings as I witnessed his sufferings. As I listened to his labored breathing and felt his pulseless wrist, I knew that he must die. We watched his feeble, grasping breath until it ceased. My heart ached as though it would break. So you can only imagine the pain that Ellen went through watching her little baby die. And when James returned, he, the father, conducted the funeral service. So our pioneers sacrificed a lot. Families, their own health. That's not a good example in that sense for us today. But again, they were at a unique situation, building a church where it required everything that you had to give. And James did that to the expense of his own health. Here's a family picture of the Whites in 1865. Here are the two surviving children who lived into adulthood. You have little Willie here, who would grow up to manage his mother's writings and her editorial staff. And then you have Edson, who I spoke of this morning. Edson the bad boy. Yet Edson would grow up and also make a contribution, significant contribution to the church, but for him it took a long time to get to that point. I want to tell you the story about these two young men. James Edson, throughout his lifetime, was known by his middle name to differentiate him from his father. He became a minister, printer, and missionary to former African-American slaves in the southern United States. Before I get into the story of his later life, here is a picture of the young Edison with the elder Edson. I said Edison. Edson, the younger Edson with the elder Edson. Edson, as a young man, he was the bad boy. That's probably no better way to put it. In 1854, when Edson was 5 years old, Ellen White wrote a letter to a friend and made this interesting comment. You have seen Henry. Well, Edson has more life and roughery than Henry, so you must know my hands are full. It appears that Willie and Henry had a temperament similar to their mother, but Edson was totally different. And so he and his mother just didn't really even connect in terms of personality. So that, at the very beginning, proved to be challenging. In 1865, as a teenager, Edson was already getting into all kinds of trouble. He would violate every principle his mother wrote and taught. One time, he took a month's salary, $26, and bought an expensive coat and paraded up and down the streets in front of the Battle Creek, in front of the Review and Herald office. He wore a watch with a golden chain link on it, and he read literature that his mother spoke against, the soap opera literature of the day, fiction, novels, cheap novels. He did everything his mother told him not to do. In fact, she even tells the story that Edson would come to church, prop his feet on the pew in front of him, lay his head back, and sleep through the sermon, sitting right next to Prophet Mom. So his mother had some real challenges. And, what would others think about this founder of the church? And yet she couldn't control her own son. So Ellen White had some real struggles, and as I mentioned this morning, James and Ella had some of their biggest fights on dealing with Edson. They were even upset over the girl he eventually married. He married somebody they didn't want him to marry. Was Ellen White a perfect parent?
No.
She wrote a lot about parenting, but that was in later life. She was a good parent when you read about how she parented, the letters and so forth, but she was not a perfect parent. In fact, she made some mistakes in parenting. Let me share with one of them. Here's a letter that she wrote to Edson. She's describing his disposition to disobedience, and this is one of many, many letters she wrote to Edson. She described his disobedience, his deception. She said, you, quote, you not only disobeyed us yourself, but led Willie, who was 5 years younger, to disobedience. A thorn has been planted in my heart from that time, when I became convinced that you could not be trusted. A gloom which I cannot express shrouds our minds in regard to your influence upon Willie. This influence, we have seen, has affected our noble-hearted, truthful Willie. Now, Willie was evidently a good little boy, even at 5 years old age. You do things and enjoin upon him strict secrecy, and when questioned, he evades it by saying, I don't know. You go, Willie, what about this? I don't know. Nowadays, kids say whatever. That's the term my kids use, whatever. I got so sick of hearing whatever, I'd get on to them about this and they'd say whatever. Off would come the belt. That whatever, I don't want to hear about that. Well, I guess the 19th century is, I don't know. Did you do this? I don't know. What happened to this broken vase? I don't know. But Ellen was really struggling here. He evades it by saying, I don't know, when he does know. And thus you lead him to lie in order to keep concealed your cherished darling projects. Oh, Edson, it is the knowledge of these things, and listen to this, that is wearing me out and bringing upon me discouragement, which will compel me to cease laboring in the cause of God. Sometimes Ellen White herself was so discouraged, she thought of giving it all up. Just quit. You had so little sense of the true value of character. You seemed as much pleased in the society of Marcus Ashley, that was Edson's bad boy friend, Marcus Ashley, as with your own innocent brother Willie. And then she said this about Willie, in contrast to Edson. He is a treasure, beloved of God, but I fear your influence will ruin him. Now that was not a good idea, to compare little innocent Willie and Edson like that, okay? Willie was the good boy, but you, Edson, you're the bad boy. Willie's my treasure, beloved of God, but your influence will ruin him. You ever done that to your kids? Compare them like that? Probably not. Then she went on to say, my poor Willie, I see no way for us but to cease traveling and do what we can to save our own children. Well, this comparison between little good and innocent Willie and Edson's bad behavior became a claw in Edson's side the rest of his life. He had jealousy for his brother, even into adulthood. Now, they got along in adulthood, but he still remembered that, and there was conflict because of that. That was not a good idea for any parent to do. Now, years later, Ellen would learn by experience, and she would counsel parents on good principles of parenting through vision she had received, as well as learning through her own experience. Now, in other areas of her mothering, she was very positive and helpful. But she wasn't perfect, and this probably was an area that would cause her heartache in future years, because Edson, over the years, got so tired of this that he eventually came to a point where he was going to reject everything. Now, he married a girl some years later that neither Ellen nor James approved of. In fact, Ellen wrote Edson and said, regarding his father's feelings about his marriage, Father weeps over your case, but we are both at a loss to know what to say or do in your case. We view it just alike. You are at present not fitted to have a family, for in judgment you are a child, in self-control the child. But in spite of how much hopelessness she felt over Edson, she said, Dear and much loved son, she penned, my heart bleeds for you. I cannot give you up. And so, years later, many letters, Edson is in his early 40s. He's had it with Adventism. He's had it with his brother. He's had it with Christianity. He writes Willie and tells him, I'm going to not only leave Adventism, but I'm going to give up Christianity altogether. Willie, of course, shared that with his mother, Ellen. She was naturally grief-stricken. The Lord had actually given her a dream after that about Edson. And so she wrote one of her most powerful appeals to her son, Edson. One of her many epistles, but perhaps, no, not perhaps, indeed, her most significant letter she ever wrote to Edson. It's interesting how she begins it. It tells us a lot about how Edson had treated previous letters. She said, Edson, please read this carefully. Do not cast it aside or burn it. Evidently, he had burned some of her previous letters. And the postscript noted that she was sorry that the letter was in her scribbling handwriting. Most of her letters were typewritten by her typist, but certain letters that were very personal to individuals or to family, she handwrote herself and did not put in the hands of a typist because she didn't want the typist to see it. And this was one of those letters. In fact, the postscript said, she apologized for the scribbling. I do not want to put it in the hands of the typist. So she, in only a way that a mother can, appealed to Edson to not leave the faith, to come back to Christ. And she shared with him the dream that the Lord had given her regarding Edson's experience, and it struck a chord in his heart. And he thought about it, and he gave his heart to the Lord again, and he wrote to Willie and shared the experience, and then to his mother, his conversion. And his first question was, after being converted, what can I do for the Lord? What can I do? And it was about that time that a new work was opening up. For you see, that was in the late 1870s, early 1880s. And the Reconstruction after the Civil War was finished. You know, after the Civil War, Northerners didn't travel in the South. Okay? It was several decades before you could do that safely. The Reconstruction, putting the Union back together, I mean, the Civil War devastated America. And so it took several decades to heal and recover from that and restore the Union as well as the economy of the South and everything. And by the time you get to the 1870s, the Reconstruction was pretty well complete. And so Northerners could travel safely in the South. And so it was about that time a new work was opening up for African Americans in the South to bring the Adventist message to them. And Edson studied that situation and said, I want to do that. And so Edson became the pioneer for the work among blacks in the South. The churches in this community of the regional conference, that whole community of African Americans here in the South can trace their roots back to the beginning work of Edson. Now, there were others that would follow him, of course, but Edson pioneered the work. And he was very creative with it. He had bought a steamboat and went up and down the Mississippi and would stop along the shoreline, distribute literature, and minister to the African Americans that way. And hence we have a significant population of Seventh-day Adventist African Americans here in the South. And that goes back to Edson. Now, that doesn't mean Edson's life was without trouble. Some of his old character issues, he had run-ins with the brethren over the years, and when his mother died in 1915, Edson was in terrible debt. Some of the sell from her books they had to use to pay off some of Edson's debt. So while the Lord used him in a great way, and he continued serving the church the rest of his life, he wasn't trouble-free. So that is Edson in his experience. Now, Willie, as he's called by some, or William Clarence, known affectionately to all in the church as Willie, not only became a minister, but after his father's decease, he additionally served as counselor, business manager, traveling companion to his mother, and a task which God had especially called him. After James died, Ellen had a dream, and she wondered who was going to help her with her writings. James had helped her significantly with her writings. And who was going to do that now? And the Lord told her that Willie should take his father's place. And as he matured, got to that point, that's precisely what Willie did. Willie managed her entire editorial staff and her writings. In fact, today, Adventist scholars, when we want to really learn something about Ellen White, we appeal to Willie. One of my colleagues and friends at the seminary at Andrews, Jerry Moon, wrote a definitive doctoral dissertation on the relationship between Willie White and his mother. It's a fascinating study. I've read through it, use it all the time in my own studies. And it's quite an interesting dynamic between the relationship of the two. And Willie indeed took over her editorial staff, managed her writings and the editorial staff until her death. And then Willie became the first director of the Ellen G. White estate until his death in 1936. But what was he like in his earlier years? Here's a picture of the young Willie, and then you see the elder William Clarence there. Well, little Willie was just like other normal boys and girls. And when he was maybe 6, 7 years old, in his school in Battle Creek, he developed a strong dislike for the teacher. And one day after school was out, he snuck in through an open window, went to the chalkboard, and scribbled a poem about his teacher onto the board. And the next morning, when all the children and the teacher filed into the classroom, they read these words on the chalkboard. The devil flew east, west, north, and south, and picked Miss Jones up in his mouth. But when he saw he had a fool, he dropped her here to teach this school. I love telling that story. That's Willie White, the manager of Ellen White's editorial staff when he was a boy. And of course, they figured out it was Willie who wrote that. And of course, his parents were notified and he was punished. But in general, Willie did not get in trouble like that. Now, the elder Willie, as he grew older, there's interesting stories about Willie. I'll just tell this one. He was one of these people who could go to sleep anytime, anywhere, any place. You ever met those people? They could just zonk out anywhere. And he was one of those people. And one day his mother was preaching in the pulpit, a serious, solemn sermon. And Willie was sitting on the platform behind her. And here she was delivering this important message, and she noticed smiles across the faces of the audience. And they were looking beyond her shoulder, and she knew exactly what was happening. She paused, and then she could hear this deep breathing. She turned around, and Willie's beard was on his chest. He was lost to the world. He was in the deepest of deep sleep. And she turned back around to the audience, and their smiles suddenly dissipated. They weren't sure what to think. Oh boy, is he going to get in trouble? She proceeded to tell them a story. She said, now, when Willie was a little baby, I would go and preach at the Battle Creek Tabernacle Church, the huge pulpit there. And the brethren, so I could have little Willie with me, constructed a little rocker that fit perfectly in that huge pulpit. And so when I would go up to preach, I would put little Willie in there. And with my feet, I could rock him while I'm preaching the sermon. And he would sleep through my whole sermon. As you can see, today, he's not gotten over that habit. And of course, everybody appreciated that humor. And most people think that Ellen White had a lot to say about preachers and humor. And in fact, when I left here, I went up to Broadview Academy, and I was the youth pastor there for a couple of years before I went to Southern. And as a youth pastor, you've got to use humor. And I used humor in my sermons. And some well-intentioned member was offended by that up in Chicago area. And they put a thick document on my porch. Didn't face me, eyeball to eyeball, toe to toe. They just put this document on my porch, and I came out the next morning, and it was all these Ellen White quotes where she speaks against ministers using humor. But if you read those in context, in the 19th century, the typical preacher would get up and before he ever got into a sermon, tell a joke that was not related to the sermon. That's what she's talking about. Appropriate humor, Ellen White was fine with that. And there were other times where she used humor in a positive, healthy way that didn't distract from the sermon. The story about Willie was most appropriate. So Ellen White was not against an appropriate type of humor in the pulpit, and she was certainly not against humor in life. She saw things funny. In fact, in the Elms Haven home, the last 15 years of her life, her grandchildren, who would grow up to be adults and elderly folk in the late 20th century would tell us stories, and they said whenever Grandma White laughed, no matter where you were in the Elmshaven home, you could hear her belly laugh anywhere, which tells us she must have laughed a lot for them to remember that event. So Ellen White was a very balanced person, and I'm going to tell you some stories more about her humor here in a little bit. But that was Willie. Let me walk you through some pictures of Ellen White as she aged. Here she is. I showed you a picture of her in her early 30s this morning. Here she is in her late 30s, in the mid to late 1860s. That's a very interesting photograph. She posed for that. That has caused trouble in recent years, particularly when it was shown in the 20th century, because it gives you the idea, and this is a subject I don't have time to get into unless you have a question about it during the Q&A. It's regarding inspiration. The picture leads you to believe that God spoke to her, and she wrote down every word God spoke to her. She's looking off almost as in a trance, and God is speaking to her. That's not what she meant to convey at all by the picture, but some have interpreted it that way. And inspiration did not work that way. God did not dictate the words to the prophets of the Bible or to Ellen White. He used more a process that I call in my book whole person inspiration, where God works with the whole person. That's why Ellen White could read from other authors, and it would stimulate things she had seen in vision and write that down and so forth. But inspiration is much more holistic, and so that picture has caused some trouble. In fact, if you Google 19th century pictures of women, you will find that almost universally, women were pictured in the 19th century as consumers. They were reading a book. Never do you see a woman writing something, producing something, except this picture with Ellen White. So that's quite a contrast to pictures of 19th century women who, women didn't speak and preach in the 19th century. They just read. They consumed things. They weren't producers. So this has given Adventists a wrong impression that Ellen White never read. But in fact, Ellen White read profusely. Her entire library is at the White Estate in Silver Springs, Maryland, 800 plus volumes. So she did do a lot of reading. Here she is at 48 years old in 1875. And this is an engraving about the same time period. This is a popular photograph in 1878. This was taken when she was completing the third volume of The Spirit of Prophecy, which portrayed the last days of Christ's ministry. I mentioned that series, the Spirit of Prophecy series, this morning. So this picture is shown often with Ellen White. Here she is with her sister Elizabeth Bangs, who I shared her story with you this morning. I said that Lizzie was very disappointed over the disappointment, over their disfellowship. The whole Harmon family was disfellowshipped from the church, and Lizzie took it very hard and rejected Christianity. On her deathbed, Ellen wrote a letter appealing to Lizzie to come to Christ. This shows you the evangelistic heartbeat of Ellen G. White. I want to share with you some excerpts from that letter. This tells you a lot about Ellen White. She wrote a lot in the letter about the love of Jesus and his ability to save everyone who comes to him. She wrote to Lizzie, quote, "Don't you believe on Jesus, Lizzie? Do you not believe he is your Savior? That he has evidenced his love for you in giving his own precious life that you might be saved? All that is required of you is to take Jesus as your own precious Savior. To everyone inquiring, what must I do to be saved? I answer, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. No, become a vegetarian. Keep the Sabbath. Join the Seventh-day Adventist Church. That's what will save you." It's not what she said, is it? Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. That's Ellen White's understanding of salvation, of certainly becoming a Seventh-day Adventist, and vegetarianism and Sabbatarianism. Those are very important to Ellen White, but not as important as Jesus Christ and knowing him. So I answer, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. Do not doubt for a moment but that he wants to save you just as you are. No one will ever be compelled to be saved. The Lord Jesus forces the will of none. And by the way, that phrase right there is a clear reaction against Calvinism. The teaching of John Calvin, our Presbyterian friends, the idea that God is foreordained, who's going to be saved and who's going to be lost. There's no choice in the matter. She's making it clear that God forces even salvation on no one. We all must choose it. She went on to say, with Jesus as your best friend, you need not fear to die. For it will be to you like the closing your eyes here and opening them in heaven. Lizzie, my heart longs to see you trusting Jesus, for he can give you his grace to bear all your acute sufferings. He loves you. He wants to save you. That's the evangelist Ellen White. She was quite a personal evangelist, and she wanted her sister to be in heaven. But as far as she could tell and the rest of the family, Lizzie did not accept her invitation. Lizzie died from all outward perspectives without giving her heart to Jesus. So that's why Ellen would say later that she did not expect to see Lizzie in heaven. Certainly a disappointment for her. Here's a photograph of Ellen White in her mid-50s. Shortly after this, James White would die in 1881, after this picture was taken. Here she is at the Reno, Nevada campground in May 1888. 1888 is a significant year in Adventist history. Can anybody tell me why? What would happen later that year? The famous Minneapolis General Conference in the fall of 1888, where the subject of righteousness by faith was the focus and the debate. And that literally changed a lot of things in the church. That's an important event in history that you might want to be aware of. Ellen White is in this picture. There she is holding her Bible, and she would play a significant role at the 1888 General Conference later that year. That was the most controversial, spirited meeting in Adventist history. Yet it was the most important because of the theological issues. That's where salvation became the central focus. Prior to this, the last several decades, second-generation Adventism. Let me back up and say that first-generation Adventism, our pioneers were thrilled with the message and they uplifted Christ. But by the time you get to second-generation Adventism, the 1870s and 1880s, they had put Christ in the background and they were emphasizing the law and the Sabbath without Christ. Adventism was spiraling down into legalism. You can read that in the periodicals. And a crisis was building, and that crisis would explode in the Minneapolis 1888 General Conference. And that changed everything. As my friend and colleague in Ellen White Studies, George Knight, has written a lot about this subject. He says, as a result of the 1888 General Conference, the church became Christian again. So in other words, things were pretty bad in the decades prior to that. And so that put the church on the right trajectory and kept it on the path of Christianity. In other words, salvation comes by faith in Jesus Christ, not in keeping the Sabbath or obeying the law. Certainly that's important, but we obey the law and keep the Sabbath because Jesus has saved us, in honor of him saving us. Not to be saved, but because we are saved. Minneapolis made a big difference in that issue, and I'm just touching on the highlights of what was a very controversial but significant meeting. Ellen White lived in Australia for the decade of the 1890s, from 1891 to 1900. She arranged for this home to be built in Cornbong, close to what was to become Avondale College. Here she is seated at the center here, and that was a significant decade for Ellen White. That was when she completed her most significant work on the life of Christ, The Desire of Ages. Desire of Ages was written while she was in Australia, but in addition to that, because of what was going on at the Avondale College and the failure of Battle Creek College, she was determined to make Avondale College the right model of Adventist Christian education. So essentially all of her major writings on education were penned during this decade in Australia. And those writings and their principles continue to guide our massive educational system to this very day. And our educational system is at its best when it is following these principles. Her classic book, Education, written during this time. So that was a very productive decade. I should say she didn't want to go to Australia. That was after the General Conference of 1888, and the brethren weren't too happy with her. I said there was controversy, and she had run-ins with the brethren, and they arranged for her to get her out of their hair and go to Australia. And she really prayed about it. She didn't really feel like she wanted to go, but yet she felt that must be her duty. And so she ended up going, and it turned out to be a great blessing and an extremely productive decade for her. It's amazing how the Lord works, isn't it? We all have times like that in our own life. You know, is this what the Lord wants me to do? Should I do this? Ellen White experienced that. The Lord didn't tell her everything. Here is her pet dog. She named him Tiglath-Pileser, after the evil Assyrian king in 2 Kings. And people have asked me about that doghouse. What's the issue here? And for years I would talk about this picture, and I wasn't really sure myself. I just figured that, you know, it broke and they just left it that way. But in fact, because of the rainy season, they put it that way so when the rains came, Tiglath-Pileser wouldn't have to go to bed in a puddle of water. And it helped the doghouse drain. So that's why it's crooked like that. That was not because they weren't caring for the dog. They were actually caring for the dog and didn't wanted his doghouse to have a good drainage system. And the crooked doghouse evidently worked. Well, at this juncture, this is when I like to tell some of these great stories. Now, let me tell you, I'm drawing from this book for a purpose. I have these stories in other forms, but I like to use this book when I speak at various locations. George Knight's book, Walking with Ellen White, I use it to advertise from it. You hear these stories and you like them? Well, you can read more about these stories and other stories in this book, Walking with Ellen White. So if you do not have this short little book, pick it up at camp meeting next week. During camp meeting and read through it, and it gives the personal side of Ellen White, more than what I'm sharing this afternoon. But Ellen White did enjoy humor, and she used that in her writings on various occasions. And even in the Testimonies, Volume 1 of all places, we find little tidbits of humor. She was writing to women who were practicing the reform dress. You know, in the 19th century, we were big into dress just like we are today, and they wore these big fancy dresses. And Ellen White called for more simplicity in what she called reform dress. But some of the women didn't really know how to do it properly. And so she wrote about them. She says, "Sisters, when about their work, should not put on clothing which would make them look like images to frighten the crows from the corn." So just a little bit of humor in the meta imagery that she uses there. And then she was also talking to her granddaughters. She told them, "Do not dress as if you're going to a funeral." She says, "Or when the clothing of some tasteless individuals looks as if it flew and lit upon their persons." So you find time to time these images of humor that she used in her writings. And here's an interesting one. This is a story experience told by Doris E. Robinson, who in his adulthood worked in the White Estate as the editor, part of her, well, the White Estate, this is while she was still alive. He was one of the editors. And then he would work in the White Estate after Ellen White died. But as a young man, he came to work with Ellen White, and he was terrified of meeting the prophet. He thought she would be a stern, solemn woman. That's how he pictured prophets. So he was scared to death. He wrote about his experience. "I was 20 years old and very bashful, and wondered how I could live and hold converse with such a saintly woman whose conversation I expected to be entirely upon sacred things. Miss McIntyre," this was Ellen White's companion and helper in her later years, "brought in a dish of greens which Mrs. White requested at nearly every meal because she thought they were good for elderly people." Now at the dinner there were greens, and then there were these peas. Ellen White ate the greens. She didn't care for the peas, okay? But here's what happens. So Mrs. McIntyre sets a dish before Ellen White. Mrs. McIntyre set the personal dish before Sister White with the joking remark, this is of the greens, "Here is your horse feed, mother. and Doris Robinson writes, I was horrified, and I was looking to see Sister White rebuke her for this levity. Sister White glanced quickly over the table, and with a humorous glint in her eye and her mouth curved up slightly, she remarked, I don't know as my horse food is any worse than your cowpeas, the vegetable choice for others at the table. So Ellen White had no problem with little joking and humor and things like that. Now, my favorite story is when they were returning, she and her granddaughter were returning from her experience in Australia. And they came by the island of Samoa, in this big ship, and there had been a group of Adventist believers emerge. The message had gotten to the island of Samoa. And so there had been an Adventist group that was birthed on that island. Ellen wanted to stop and visit them. And so they stopped, and she and May, Willie's wife, her daughter-in-law, and May's little infant child got off the big boat onto a small boat and went in to shore. And the 3 heftive native men from Samoa walked out there, big men. It was hot in the sun. They were all sweaty. And 2 of the men locked their arms into the form of a chair and motioned to Sister White to get into their arms. And so she sat in their arms, and they carried her onto the beach and put her on a rock. And she was facing the ocean, facing the little boat. So she's seated on that rock. Then they come back, and one of the men brings an umbrella and shades May's little baby, and the other one motions to her, and he takes the baby. And then the third one, he turns his back towards May, his hot, sweaty, huge back, and motions for her to get on. Now, May is in this rocking boat on the shore, and she's in this long dress, and she's looking skeptically at this sweaty body, but she doesn't want to get wet in the water, so she slowly reaches her arm. Now, Ellen White is sitting on this rock, watching everything, taking this all in. And so May slowly gets on his back, scrambles on, locks a hold of his leg. He begins to walk, and she's bouncing, and there's the waves splashing behind, and she begins to slip, and she doesn't want to fall and hold on. And Ellen White is watching this. May would write about that later, and she says, Mother White, that's what she called her, Mother White began to laugh and laugh and laugh. She laughed so hard she fell off the rock. Now, just let that picture sink into your consciousness. Let it sink into your Adventist mind. Ellen White laughing uncontrollably that she falls off a rock. I think that's a positive image to keep in mind when you think about Ellen White, because often her writings tend to be very solemn at points, and we tend to picture her as very solemn and never smiling and laughing. Some people picture Jesus that way, but the disciples didn't know him that way. And nor did people who knew Ellen White know her that way. She was a happy person. So there was no problem with laughing and enjoying life. One time at the table, and again, this is in later years at Elmshaven, a woman who was pregnant and her husband came to sit at the dinner table at Elmshaven. And Ellen was observing this situation. The husband was really rigid. And they served 2 kinds of bread, white bread and wheat bread. And of course, the young pregnant mother, she just wanted that white bread. That was her craving. And the husband, no, you must eat this whole wheat bread. And Ellen was taking this in, and she, according to the story, she says, let her eat the white bread, please. And she gave the woman some of the white bread. There's another story where Ellen would invite children over to her house. And this is in the afternoon, and please make a note of this. This was between meals. She would feed the children cookies. Between meals. Do you get what I'm saying here? You hear what I'm saying? Between meals, she would feed the children cookies. Now, I'm not saying you should eat between meals. But I'm saying Ellen was very balanced. A very balanced person. Now, here's a shocker, and when I share this in my classroom, I tell the students, don't let this out of here. Okay? But Ellen White had a favorite dessert. People think, Ellen White, desserts, sugar? No. But she had a favorite dessert. She ate it on rare occasions. She was still temperate about it. She loved lemon pie. Lemon pie was her favorite dessert. So those of you who ate some dessert this afternoon, you don't need to feel guilty unless you had a second and third helping. So very balanced in everything that she did. She enjoyed life. She enjoyed humor, a good laugh. She enjoyed people. She was a happy person. Everyone would feel comfortable around Ellen White. Here she is in her later years. This is a picture you will see on various occasions. She was in her early 70s here. And here she is. This is an interesting picture at Oakwood Manual Training School, right close to where I was born and raised in Huntsville, Alabama. And that's not too far from where I'm living now in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Here is Ellen White pictured, and of course Oakwood is our school for African Americans and still is today. Oakwood University now. It's our sister institution to Southern. And what is interesting, this is a rare photograph. In this photograph you see something you rarely see in 19th century photographs. You see two black men right there. That rarely happened, unfortunately. The story, I spent a whole class period in my class, Adventist Heritage, lecturing on the drama of African Americans in Adventist history and racial prejudice, even within our own church in the 19th century. But this picture is very interesting because of you see that situation there. But I can tell you one thing about Ellen White. Ellen White was anything but a racist. Ellen White went to the defense of African Americans from the very beginning. She spoke out against slavery in antebellum America when no one else was saying anything in the church. She was against slavery. She was against racism in any forms. And some critics, and I think this is the most unfair and unethical charge against Ellen White, is when they try to make a racist out of her. She was categorically not a racist. She railed against any form of racism. And I deeply appreciate that about her life and writings. Here is the White family at Elmshaven. This is in 1907. Here she is as a happy grandmother with her family surrounding her. Here's Willie and May and their children. And a lot of the family that surrounded her in later years were related to Willie. Here she is at Madison, Tennessee in April 1909, the year I shared that story. This is a trip she was taking to that General Conference where I shared the story at the end of my last message, where she held up the Bible and said, "Brother, I commend to you this book." This picture was taken that year. And by the way, you'll notice that they don't smile a lot. In 19th century photography, even in the late 19th century, the exposure took a long time. Now you just try smiling for 5 minutes. Your cheeks hurt. So most pictures in the 19th century, you don't see them smiling. We don't really have a picture of Ellen White into an open smile, although others tell us that she smiled a lot. And there is one picture that a cartoonist has drawn and showing what it must have been like to see Ellen White smile. She has a nice big smile. It looks natural, and I'm sure that's how it was for her. Here she is at the 1909 General Conference. She is sitting here next to Haskell and Willie. Beside her, after James White died, Brother Haskell proposed to Ellen. And she graciously declined and said, "Well, I think the Lord just wants me to take it solo from here." That's not her exact words, but she graciously declined his invitation, and he married somebody else. Here is Ellen White, a rare photograph we have of her speaking before an audience. This was taken while she was speaking at the dedication of none other than Loma Linda Sanitarium. The only other picture we have of Ellen White, I don't have that in this slide series, is a picture of her speaking is at the 1903 General Conference in the Battle Creek Tabernacle when they were dealing with the reorganization. No, I'm sorry, 1901 General Conference. It was a 1901 General Conference where they were dealing with the reorganization of the General Conference structure. Only those two pictures we have of Ellen White speaking. She was an excellent communicator. As a student of preaching, a teacher of preachers, I'm interested in Ellen White's preaching methods and how she connected with an audience. And there's been a lot of literature, and I've read through that, and she was a greatly respected speaker. And in the 19th century, they did not have microphones like this for projection. You had your only microphone for projection was your voice. And so they had to speak from the diaphragm and throw the voice out there. And Ellen White would speak to audiences of up to 10,000 when she was visiting camp meetings. And in the 19th century, with no electronics, no microphone, she had to project her voice, and she was very effective at that. In fact, one preacher was sitting in front of a huge tent listening to Ellen White speak. This is A.V. Olson. And he could obviously hear her very clearly, and he wondered what it would be like if he went back in the tent. So he walked in this huge tent back to the middle and stood on the side. He could hear her just as clearly as when he was up front. Then he went to the back of the tent. Now, this was an Adventist tent. The back of the tent was where the entrance was. You know what happens at the entrance to Adventist camp meetings? There's lots of little mini committee meetings going on. And he was standing in the midst of that, and he could still hear her voice ringing above all the other noise. Then he went outside of the tent, some yards away, and he could hear her voice just as clearly as when he was in the tent. She knew how to project that voice and throw it out there. I teach my preaching students, you got to speak from down here. When you're preaching all day Sabbath and you got to do an evangelistic meeting, you got to protect that voice. When I do ministers meetings, when I talk on preaching, inevitably, half of them will tell me at the end of Sabbath, their voice is shut because they're speaking from up here. Ellen White wrote a lot to preachers about speaking from down here, projecting that voice. So she was very seasoned at that and very good at it. So quite an effective communicator, preacher, speaker. Here is Ellen White and Sarah McIntyre, her helper. Ellen White loved the fresh air. She took buggy rides as much as she could. In her latter years, after the 1870s, she was not able to get out and walk much. That's why she's a bit heavyset in later life. Her build led to that as well, the size of her body shape and so forth. But in addition to that, she was not able to exercise. So that's why she appears to be a bit heavyset. That was a great frustration to her because she loved to get out and walk. What happened, it was on a stage or coach or one of the wagon trains, I should say, out west. James really wanted to go on one of those. And so they went on it. And James had a great time. She described him riding the horse back and forth like a child, just having a good time like a boy. But Ellen White worked herself to death because she had to do all the cooking with all the other women. And James was having a good time and she's working, but she also at one time rode a horse and the horse bucked her off during that wagon train and broke her ankle. And of course in those days the doctors weren't able to set it, and so it was weak and she was never able to really do any serious walking with it the rest of her life. So the way she got fresh air in later life was buggy rides. And one time they were in the Washington, D.C. area and taking a buggy ride, she and Sarah McIntyre. And lo and behold, they saw a huge entourage, horses and people coming by, and it was Theodore Roosevelt, the President of the United States. Rode right by them. He tipped his hat at the two ladies. Ellen White wrote about that in her diary. She was so excited to see the President of the United States. He actually tipped his hat. She wrote about that. I mean, this woman had seen Jesus and angels in visions, and yet she was still excited to see the President of the United States. Again, this just shows how human she really was. Here is her office and household staff, her editorial staff that Willie managed. We often think that Ellen White sat down to write her books from start to finish. Not one book did she sit and write from start to finish. She wrote many things in those earlier years. And those later books, Conflict of the Age series I spoke of, even the book Steps to Christ, it is compiled from her earlier writings. And her editors would go and pull from her earlier writings and put this material together. She would instruct them what she had in mind. And then she would read through it and flesh it out, fill in the blanks, put it together as a book. And so she used, we think that she just wrote it all herself. Well, she used her editorial staff. They pulled things together and edited her writings in a significant way. She'd finish it, then she'd give it back to the editors. They would go through and edit it, and then she would look it over and give her final stamp of approval to it. This is what I mean by a broad perspective of inspiration. If you read in the Bible, Jeremiah had editors and scribes and so forth. And so this does not diminish the nature of inspiration at all. Inspiration was big enough to include editorial help. The point is the inspired person herself gave the final word on how those books were to be. Because some critics will say, her editors wrote that, not Ellen White. But all the evidence indicates it was Ellen White through and through. But she did use editorial help. I think it's good for us to realize that. Because if we have a wrong impression, when you suddenly hear something else, it can be somewhat shattering. But when you understand it in the right context, it does not diminish her inspiration at all. We see Ellen White aging here. This is 1913, two years before her death. This is her immediate family. All of these individuals, except Doris Robinson, who I told the story about a moment ago, these were related to Willie. These are the grandchildren here. This is Arthur L. White, who, when his father, Willie, died in 1936, Arthur took over the White estate and managed the White estate during much of the 20th century and made a significant contribution there. Here's Grace and the other children. This is an interesting photograph because you see something that's potentially controversial there. Do you see anything that might be controversial in this picture? Necklace. Don't say that word out loud. Yes, you see a necklace around her granddaughter here. Now, this is one decision Arthur White made. This is back in the mid-20th century. They were concerned that this would be really controversial, so they airbrushed this out. Now, nowadays, you don't dare do that. The White estate's up front and open with the internet. I mean, you don't dare hide anything. You can't hide anything. But they, not because they wanted to hide it, they just felt it would be a distraction. But years later, the White estate quit doing that. I think that was probably a mistake even back then, but they don't do that anymore. But it's not that much of a problem. It's not like she's wearing jewelry in the formal sense. This is not something that she wore on a regular basis. Only on special occasions, and this family gathering was a special occasion. This is actually a native necklace made in some islands, and it was a gift from a dear friend. And so she wore it in honor of that friend, not just for an ornamental purpose. You could still argue and say, well, isn't that still wearing jewelry? Well, we could go into those endless debates, and we don't need to get into that now. But that's the story behind this. So it wasn't really understood as formal jewelry in that sense, and that's why she probably wasn't ashamed to wear it in a picture right next to grandmother White. In early 1915, the year of her death, you perhaps have heard the story, Ellen was making her way to her study. She fell, slipped and fell in the Elmshaven home, broke her hip. She was bedridden for the next 6 months of her life. Here's a picture taken when she was bedridden. Here she is up on the second floor here with Sarah McIntyre, her helper. And during that time, she was still very alert and interested in the work, and she had several visions. Interestingly, her last visions were regarding young people, the youth of the church. That was very important to Ellen White and evidently important to the Lord. And it was in July of 1915 that her health really got bad to a crisis point. And over a series of days, she got weaker, and in July of 1915, she died. You can imagine what it must have been like for the church. Here she had been around from the very beginning, and all of a sudden, she's not there. Will someone take her place? How can the church go on without Sister White, without the gift of prophecy in our midst? You can only imagine the thoughts that were going through the heads of many of those people. Here is the funeral. July 24, 1915. There were actually 3 funerals, 2 on the west coast, and then the final funeral and burial on the east coast, of course, in Battle Creek. And here is Haskell reading the life sketch. A.G. Daniels was in the service as well. Here's the casket. And here's the graveside. Look at all the people. You can imagine this was a huge funeral. Wide attendance from Adventist audiences. This made the news. You know, when Billy Graham dies, This is going to be big news, won't it? It's going to be all across the news. Well, this was big news, even outside of the Adventist community. Ellen White was well known, and a lot of news reports had already been written, and they were released on the event of her death. This is the funeral service. Following the funeral service at the Tabernacle, Ellen White's body was taken to Oak Hill Cemetery in Battle Creek, Michigan, where she was laid to rest by the side of her husband, James. And it tells you some of the things that took place there. And here is the family burial plot. It's different today. There's a big wall that stands there now. But you had a Bible in the shape of flowers with Revelation 22:12. Behold, I come quickly, and my reward is with me. And so that is, in a nutshell, the life of Ellen White. Her life is best summed up by A.G. Daniels, our most famous, significant General Conference president in Adventist history. In his book, he wrote toward the end of his life, The Abiding Gift of Prophecy, he describes the person of Ellen White, and he does it quite effectively. In this present year of our Lord, 1935, Mrs. White has been at rest 20 years, while I have been toiling on. I had had 23 years of direct observation of her life work. Since her death, I have now had 20 additional years for thoughtful reflection and study of that life and its fruits. Now at an advanced age, with the constraint of expressing only sober, honest truth, I can say that it is my deep conviction that Mrs. White's life far transcends the life of anyone I have ever known or with whom I have been associated. And he worked with Mrs. White for several decades before she died, so he really knew her well. She was uniformly pleasant, cheerful, and courageous. She was never careless, flippant, or in any way cheap in conversation or manner of life. She was the personification of serious earnestness regarding the things of the kingdom. I never once heard her boast of the gracious gift God had bestowed upon her or of the marvelous results of her endeavors. She did rejoice in the fruitage, but gave all the glory to him who wrought through her. I realize that these are grave statements, but they come from the deepest conviction and soundest judgment that I am capable of rendering. They are uttered in the sobering atmosphere of my last illness as I face the judge of all the earth, before whose presence I realize that I soon shall stand. And not too long after writing these words, A.G. Daniels went to sleep in Jesus. That's a great description of Ellen White.